Modernity did not just change the world, it changed what human beings counted as real. That is why the phrase "the real world" matters. People say things like, "In the real world, nobody pays you to care," or "In the real world, what matters is results." But notice what happens when we say that. When people say "in the real world," they often mean the world of facts, outcomes, money, efficiency, competition, production, and control. But that is not the world in full. It is reality filtered through modernity's hierarchy. Notice what gets made secondary: meaning, care, embodiment, dependency, ecology, relation, the future. These are not outside the real world. They are what the real world depends on. And when a society treats what it depends on as secondary, its reality becomes powerful but brittle. That is the crisis. Modernity taught us to make sense of the world by privileging some realities over others. Subject over object, mind over body, facts over values, humans over nature. In short, it taught us to divide reality into the primary and the secondary. Reduction is not failure, it is strategy. One of the great achievements of modernity was learning how to make complexity manageable. Science isolates variables. Economics reduces value to measurable quantities. Bureaucracies standardize populations into categories, and industrial systems optimize efficiency through repetition and control. Abstraction made the world scalable. Measurement made it predictable. Standardization made it governable. And narrowing attention to what could be stabilized and measured generated extraordinary power. This is why PHET can never be anti-science. The achievements of modern science are real. The problem is not that reduction failed. The problem is that reduction gradually became mistaken for the whole structure of reality. Because every abstraction excludes. It has to. To make something clear, a system has to decide what counts and what does not count, what belongs inside the frame, and what can be treated as background. That is how clarity becomes possible. But it is also where the risk begins. The problem is not abstraction. The problem is when abstraction forgets what it had to exclude in order to become clear. Because once reduction becomes dominant, the things that resist reduction begin to appear secondary. Interpretation, context, embodiment, temporality, care, meaning, relation, not unreal, just less fundamental. And that shift changed far more than science. It changed what counted as knowledge and eventually what counted as reality. In the previous video, we looked at two operations that appear everywhere in knowledge: the what and the why. The what identifies, it stabilizes, it determines what counts and what does not. What happened? What is this? What variables matter? What can be measured? What can be verified? The why relates, it explains, it asks how things connect. Why did this happen this way? Why does this matter? Why does this count here, under these conditions, for these people, across this history, toward these futures? These operations are different, but they are inseparable. There is no what without some corresponding why, and there is no why without some grounding what. They develop together. Every what implies some frame of relevance, and every deeper why can change what becomes visible as a what. But modernity increasingly organized them hierarchically. The stabilized what became primary. The relational why became secondary. Facts appeared more real than meanings. Measurements appeared more rigorous than interpretations. Outcomes appeared more serious than lived consequences. The real world became the world of numbers, objects, incentives, competition, production, and measurable results. And everything harder to stabilize began to look softer, more subjective, less rigorous, less real. From a PHET perspective, this hierarchy is unstable because what and why are not separable. They co-develop. The why is not something added after the facts. It is part of how facts become intelligible in the first place. So the claim so far is simple. Modernity did not just use reduction. It began to treat what reduction could stabilize as more real than what reduction had to exclude. Modernity did not just create new technologies or institutions. It also normalized a particular model of a human being. The detached observer, the rational individual, the self-contained subject confronting a world of objects. Knowledge increasingly became associated with distance, neutrality, abstraction, and control. Knowing came to mean standing outside what was known. And this model of the human was never entirely neutral. It carried assumptions about rationality, autonomy, gender, civilization, and even what counted as fully human. As modernity spread through colonial expansion, this model increasingly became universalized. The detached, rational, self-contained subject was treated not as one historical way of understanding the human, but as the human itself. And once that happened, difference could easily appear as deficiency. Ways of life organized more strongly around relation, tradition, spirituality, communal identity, ecological embeddedness, or alternative temporal structures increasingly appeared not simply different, but underdeveloped. Colonialism did not just expand political and economic power. It also expanded an epistemological grammar, a way of organizing knowledge, a way of organizing the human, a way of organizing reality. And the more successful modernity became at prediction, extraction, coordination, and technological expansion, the more natural its assumptions appeared. But reduction always excludes something. And over time, modernity increasingly struggled to perceive dimensions of reality that could not be easily isolated, stabilized, measured, or controlled. Ecological interdependence, historical situatedness, embodiment, care, dependency, labor, long-term consequences, interpretation, memory, meaning, these did not disappear, but they became harder to treat as foundational within the dominant grammar of knowledge. They became background, context, externalities, secondary concerns. And this matters because what gets called secondary is often not secondary at all. Care is not secondary to autonomy. Embodiment is not secondary to reason. Ecology is not secondary to production. Labor is not secondary to capital. Context is not secondary to knowledge. Memory is not secondary to identity. Relation is not secondary to the individual. These are not decorative additions to reality. They are often the relational conditions of possibility for what calls itself primary. The excluded dimensions of reality did not disappear. They accumulated. And eventually, many of modernity's greatest successes began generating forms of complexity that reduction alone could no longer comfortably manage. This created a powerful feedback loop. The more modernity succeeded, the more its underlying assumptions appeared unquestionably true. Science predicted the world with astonishing accuracy. Technology transformed everyday life. Industrial systems expanded productivity on unprecedented scales. Bureaucracies coordinated populations. Colonial expansion extended European power across the globe. Markets reorganized societies around growth, exchange, and productivity. And because the framework worked so effectively in many domains, its ontology increasingly appeared self-evident. Success itself became epistemological evidence. The detached observer seemed real because systems built around that observer produced extraordinary results. The autonomous individual seemed primary because institutions learned to treat people as separable units. The economy seemed independent because social and ecological relations were pushed outside the model. The measurable seemed more real because measurement produced power. But there's a difference between a framework that works powerfully under certain conditions and a framework that fully captures the structure of reality itself. That distinction matters because systems built primarily through reduction often become brittle when complexity exceeds what their categories can comfortably integrate. They may be locally justified, but relationally insufficient. They work inside the frame until what the frame excluded returns. This is why the idea of externalities is so revealing. An externality is something that a system treats as outside its central calculation. Pollution, care work, exhaustion, social fragmentation, ecological damage, historical trauma, loss of trust, future instability. These are called external because they sit outside the model, but they are not outside reality. They are outside the frame. From a PHET perspective, externalities are not just side effects. They are failures of temporal relational integration. They are where a system stores what its why cannot integrate. A system defines it what? Growth, efficiency, productivity, profit, security, output. Then it narrows the why, because growth is good, because efficiency is rational, because markets optimize, because numbers prove success, because measurable outcomes show progress. And for a while, this can work. The indicators may improve, the system may appear justified, the narrative may look successful. But if the wider relations are not integrated, ecology, care, labor, embodiment, meaning, history, trust, future consequence, then the success becomes brittle. The system may be right enough to become powerful, but not integrated enough to remain true. So this is the pattern. What cannot be integrated does not disappear. It is displaced. And over time, displacement becomes crisis. This is why so many modern crises increasingly feel connected. We can see this now because the crises no longer stay in their assigned categories. Climate change is not simply an environmental problem. It is also the return of ecological relations treated as secondary for too long. Economic instability is not simply a technical failure. It reveals what happens when social life is reorganized around metrics that cannot integrate the full cost of their own success. Political polarization is not simply disagreement. It is the collapse of shared interpretive frameworks capable of holding complexity together. AI is not simply a technological puzzle. It exposes what representation can do when it lacks lived temporal integration. A system can optimize for an outcome without integrating the embodied, social, and future-oriented relations that make that outcome matter. And many people experience meaning itself as increasingly fragile. These crises differ in content, but they share a structural failure. Modernity's crises are not failures of intelligence, they are failures of integration. Not because reduction stopped working, but because reduction alone becomes insufficient when systems become deeply relational, temporally entangled, and globally interconnected. What modernity treated as secondary did not disappear. It returned as crisis. This is why the phrase, "the real world," is so revealing. At the beginning of this video, I said that when people talk about the real world, they often mean the world modernity learned to make primary. The world of measurable outcomes, market incentives, production, external results, competition, control. But by now, we can see the problem. That is not simply the real world. It is a historically produced hierarchy of reality. And that hierarchy teaches us to treat some things as serious, objective, practical, and adult, while treating others as soft, emotional, subjective, or naive. Care, embodiment, dependency, vulnerability, social trust, meaning, relation, future possibility. But these are not outside the real world. They are what the real world depends on. So the phrase, "the real world," does something subtle but powerful. It turns modernity's exclusions into common sense. It makes one way of organizing reality feel like reality itself. But PHET is asking us to look again. The real world was never just facts and outcomes. The real world is also relation, context, memory, embodiment, care, ecology, meaning, and future possibility. Modernity became powerful by narrowing what needed to be integrated. That narrowing produced clarity, prediction, control, growth, technology, scale. But it also produced exclusions. And those exclusions accumulated in externalities, in gendered, racial, class, colonial, and ecological hierarchies, in social fragmentation, in the fragility of meaning, in the fragility of the future itself. So the next question is not only, what did modernity build? The deeper question is, what did modernity teach us to treat as secondary? Because the future may depend on recognizing something modernity made difficult to see. What we call secondary was often the relational condition of possibility for everything we call primary. That's what we'll explore in the next video. If you'd like to explore how consciousness, meaning, knowledge, and society connect through time, consider subscribing. I am, therefore I think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.